The Iliad is the tale of the siege of Ilium, better known to us as Troy, though this may be considered only the backdrop to a cast of heroes, kings and gods vying for glory, revenge and satisfaction. Though containing some fantastical elements, it purports to be the remembrances of what we might call a dark age, but they knew it as a heroic age. Men since those times were largely poor imitations, and so legitimacy derived from relation to the heroes of that time, whether celebrated in the Iliad or an adjacent myth. Even after others could claim to have superseded the qualities and achievements of them, the Age of Heroes represented something more pure that later ages could not match. Such as it was for the Greeks and Romans, so it has also been for the Brythonic heroic age, the age of King Arthur and his knights. Beyond this, the comparison is a little weaker, as the Greek epics were thought to have a sacred quality to them, and gave insight into the ways of the gods. In the Arthurian epic, meanwhile, the gods are largely silent. Magic, providence, and prophecy might give us an insight into their ways and desires, but it is much more mysterious. The qualities of the knights and magicians themselves are what dictate events, and thus the kingdom rises on their honour and falls in their shame. Even the discovery of the Holy Grail is not a matter of divine selection, but rather it is a question of the right man, given the opportunity, who conducts himself in the correct way. Perhaps this is why the revival of an Arthurian ethos has been so much more successful than the attempts to revive the ethos of the Greek heroic age. To show a man how to act honourably and shower him in glory for doing so is easier than to try to show a man how he might become favoured by the gods. There have been multiple revivals of interest in the Arthurian epic, and each has tended to emphasise different elements of it. They ask it different questions in respect to their present age, and though the answer is generally quite similar, it has different implications. When the history of the kings of Britain was first written and published, it implicitly cautioned against the looming threat of civil war, ultimately unsuccessfully, as it precedes the period we know as the Anarchy. Afterwards, with the accession of Henry II, the same telling yielded different implications. A returned Arthur from his adventuring in France to unite the realm again, and restore order after the chaos. A claim bolstered by the claimed Romano-Briton origins of the Plantagenets. Later, Malory's version of the death of Arthur was taken up by Henry VII, fulfilling a similar role as Henry II in restoring order and throwing out the foreign mercenaries. However, the same texts are used by Elizabeth I to encourage a culture of courting and dedication by her noble subjects, reinforced with tournaments, jousts, and extravagances of both gift and display for her affection. All of this can be justly drawn from the Arthurian canon, and so it is little wonder that later interest had its own unique interpretation. Ironically, after a period of disinterest, the renewed curiosity was spurred by the movement which sought to destroy it, the Enlightenment. Originally viewed as an extension of the superstitious and irrational Dark Age, the drive to discover the truth of the period showed a great deal to celebrate. After an initial overcorrection of hostility to the medieval era, there was a new surge of interest. But it took a little more to push it all the way into the public consciousness. Especially at the highest levels, interest in the classical world remained dominant, until the association became tarnished by association with the French revolutionaries. Britain retreated from all things associated with the movement, both at a low level and at a high level. Where the French grew to hate their king, Britain grew to love hers. While France dispossessed and murdered their aristocrats, Britain lionised hers. As France tried to destroy their religious institutions and their traditions, Britain celebrated and revered hers. Even the classical biases of George III bowed to the trend, and he began to embrace his conservative impulses, patronising the new Gothic-style architecture. Soon after, his son, George IV, embraced the movement even more enthusiastically. At first, the movement tried to pick up where their forebears left off, hosting tournaments and jousts for exclusive aristocratic membership and gathering. But the more bookish enthusiasts sought out the influential texts of the period. The Song of Roland and the Nibelungenlied were both popular, but among medieval romances, all roads lead to King Arthur and his knights. A young Tennyson discovered a reprint of Malory's Death of Arthur in the Somersby Rectory Library, and sparked a love affair which burned hot across the Anglo world for another century. At first, reprints were organised, but Tennyson felt the pull of many men both before and after him, and had to create his own interpretation of the tale. In time, his became, in a sense, the official Victorian telling, due to his portrayal of the knights and Arthur himself as less morally dubious than his predecessors' portrayals. Their actions are beyond reproach, and insofar as they bring about the destruction of the realm, it is due to a misunderstanding, else their misdeeds are left vague and unspecified. The main exception is Guinevere, who undermines her husband Arthur and all that he has built through her adultery. The result is a cast of peerlessly virtuous knights, who each act as paragons, but sometimes embody a particular trait more fully, only undermined by carnal immorality. And while this was not the only expression of chivalry venerated during the period, it was the most complete and widespread. Children's editions were produced. The original Mallory version remained in print. Tennyson's pseudo-official version was widely proliferated, but there was another. The Arthurian Renaissance in the 19th century, best remembered now, is not the one which was most influential at the time, not least due to its exploration of taboos, otherwise scrubbed from the source material, but completed the picture nonetheless. The Pre-Raphaelites became far more enamoured with the themes of courtly love on the one hand, and more explicit love on the other. Emphasis was always placed on love rather than the more erotic implications, though both artist and audience were very well aware that those implications were very much present. Earlier writers seemed to truly insist that fruition of the courtly romance was diminishing, not merely in the moral sense, but also that it would never meet the perfected desires and expectations of both parties, and would inevitably be disappointing and sullying. The Pre-Raphaelites do not seem to have taken the same care to emphasise this distinction, and were sure to include certain sultry details which, though not enough to generate true scandal, were clear in their meaning. And so we have the Arthurian romances separated into some of its constituent parts, then concentrated. The love and romance will be left here, but much as the gentleman embodied the perfected virtues of the Arthurian chivalry, so too is there a case to be made that the Pre-Raphaelite version of the Arthurian romantic was presented to more than receptive audiences. Alongside this, the Romantic school, exemplified by the Pre-Raphaelites, was fascinated by the questing, warrior heroics, and the untamed expanse which the knights endured. All of these themes show up in their paintings and writing, but none so much as the love and raw passion. For the generation of gentlemen raised on Arthurian literature and the associated chivalric canon, a few core ideals were held aloft and celebrated, most exemplified by the oath sworn to King Arthur by his knights in Tennyson's telling. I made them to lay their hands on mine and swear, to reverence the king as if he were their conscience, and their conscience as their king, to break the heathen and uphold the Christ, to ride abroad redressing human wrongs, to speak no slander, no, nor listen to it, to honour his own word, as if his gods, to lead sweet lives in purest chastity, to love one only, cleave to her, and worship her by years of noble deeds, until they won her, for indeed I knew of no more subtle master under heaven than is the maiden passion for a maid. Not only to keep down the base in man, but teach high thoughts and amiable words, and courtliness and desire of fame, and love of truth, and all that makes a man. One could easily imagine these lessons coming straight from the mouth of a Victorian moralist schoolmaster. And this was a conscious choice by Tennyson, but it is certainly not totally unrepresentative of the ideals of Arthurian chivalry. And yet, it is clear to see, just from this passage, an outline of Britain's imperial posture during the Victorian and Edwardian period. The extent to which the gentleman ideal was a product of the revival of the chivalric ideal, or vice versa, is likely impossible to know for sure. But they were certainly mutually reinforcing. Even more reinforcing is how these ideals, and those demonstrated elsewhere in the canon, were both opportunities sought and available, and evident in men of their day, implicitly issuing a challenge for others to live up to those same standards, or perhaps even compete for the greatest honour. Did Charles Gordon of Khartoum not live a life of chastity, break the heathen, and ride abroad, redressing human wrongs? Was John Nicholson of the Indian Mutiny, the Lion of the Punjab, not a man whose conscience was as his king, and his king as his conscience, honouring his word as the word of God, and neither spoke nor would hear slander? And did Scott's expedition not represent one of the last finest quests available for the gentlemen of the age? And having embarked on it, who could rebuke the courage and honour of men like Oates, who sacrificed himself for his comrades, and in turn, men like Scott, who would sooner die himself than live knowing he had left the injured in his care to their fate? These and plenty more were the contemporary titans of chivalry for the 19th and 20th century gentlemen. With such figures freshly appearing to be celebrated year by year, and join the pantheon of heroes, is it any wonder that any such acts of duty and courage were spread to ever larger groups of people? When HMS Birkenhead was sunk, after the orderly evacuation of the women and children to safety, for lack of additional lifeboats, it is said that the crew stood to attention on deck, in perfect order, and waited for the end. So too for the sinking of the Titanic. After conducting the same Birkenhead drill, though mostly just civilians, they accepted the sinking with calm and dignity. in many cases carrying on as though there was no danger. Some were even begged to join the evacuation, like Mr. Walter Douglas, but replied, "No, I must be a gentleman." The fever pitch of duty came in 1914, when the call was put out that the country was in danger and needed its men to do their duty to defend it. Within 2.5 months, just under 900,000 men volunteered. To put that into greater perspective, roughly 1 in 6 military-aged men in Britain volunteered when their country merely asked. At this point, it might seem that we're a long way from King Arthur, but a cursory look over the imagery used in posters and the terminology used will show how close those ideals were held to heart. Extolling the honour and glory of fair Britannia, and bidding that her sons defend it, in a dedication to her as pure as to any courtly lady of old Camelot. If only the story ended there, then perhaps the tradition and ideals would have still been recognisably with us today. But instead, 1914 became 1915, and then 1916. Though many were able to exhibit heroism and the knightly traits they'd been brought up to revere, for many more, the day-to-day realities undermined many parts of their worldview. Some resorted to mere survivalism, some rebuked their previous beliefs, and plenty of the gentlemen and noble classes simply died while trying to lead by example. The only groups still holding on to the old ideals were the civilians and women left behind, but this only built resentment, as those who had not experienced it bid men go and find glory, and championed the warriors out in the field, despite those same men usually thinking nothing of the sort, and saw more commonality between soldiers of all nations than with their own nation's civilians. The following peace made cynics of even more people, and whatever traces of chivalric attitude remained after the First War were fully consumed by the Second. Through all of this, I've presented this movement implicitly as a social one, and the ideals transmitted purely socially by imitation and teaching. While this may be true, it would be improper that I not present at least one other possible explanation. Perhaps instead of proliferating the tales again, we are instead rediscovering them, and not merely as literary works or even history, but as a reorienting towards values and mores that we naturally wish to gravitate towards, but are distracted or confused in other eras. The 18th century would be one such era, but we still produced heroes who were later elevated as figures of chivalric virtue, such as General Wolfe, a thoughtful and cultured man who could rise to the challenges of command when required, exhibiting boundless energy, but even then retained an appreciation of art and love. Though not living in an age of chivalry, he might be just as easily be found in the age of Arthur, or that of the troubadours, or of the Chevalier Bayard. Presented with such examples, one cannot help but wonder if these ideals are in the blood, possible to hide or obfuscate, but never fully extinguish, so long as the people who hold them live on. But when these ideas are rediscovered and properly expressed, England may once again boast a new host of knights, 1 million or more strong.